All right. So we talked about these steps in giving a conceptual analysis, not the last meeting, but the meeting before. And, if that felt like a lot or like you don't really understand that sort of thing, that totally makes sense. This is something that really like you learn to do in practice. So I tailored some of the wording in a way to help sort of direct how we're going to be going about giving conceptual analyses in these sort of ethical inquiries that we're going to be engaging in this class. So when we are taking that first step, so taking a step back, the first thing that we want to do is really think about what ethical question is on the table. So we want to be thinking about, like specifically what kind of behavior are we looking at? And the question being, is that kind of behavior good behavior? Is that something we want to say people are, doing something they're morally obligated to do? Is that kind of behavior bad behavior? Is that behavior morally wrong? And importantly, when we're looking at that question, we want to think about what the stakes are. So in your group activity, in the second part of the class today, we're going to be looking at this question. Is it morally okay? Is it morally wrong for us to eat non-human animals? So immediately there, the stakes are high in a number of ways. First and foremost, if it turns out that it's wrong, this is something like a lot of people eat meat. I think a lot of people here probably eat meat, right? I, just for the record, eat meat, right? But if the answer to this question turns out to be yes, it's wrong to do that, we have a pretty widespread practice of a lot of people eating meat. Another stake involved is, diet, what people consume, what they rely on for nutrition, is a huge part of our lives, right? And not just in terms of, consuming a thing to give ourselves energy so we survive. Eating is something, eating, making food, like that can be a huge and important thing in so many different communities. Like it might just be something for your, something that you do like with your family, with your friends. That's a really important thing. It could be something for some people culturally, eating certain meals, making certain meals, knowing how to do things like that. Those are really important things. And meat might play a really big role in that, right? So there, if the question turns out to be no, it's not morally wrong, then if it turns out to be no, it's not morally wrong, but we have a group of people who are arguing otherwise, right? Then in that case, what we're thinking about there, the stakes there, we need to bear in mind is that meat might play a really huge role in people's lives, and it might be morally wrong to lay down some really hard people who lay down these really hard ethical judgments concerning people who do in fact eat meat, right? So we want to think about those kinds of stakes. Does anybody have does anybody have any questions right off the bat about just in general, identifying questions and then identifying the stakes there? Does that seem like a clear enough thing? Okay. The second, once we identify, what question, which is in this class is going to be, is X morally permissible? Is it wrong? Are we morally obligated to do X? Those kinds of questions. After we identify that question, we get a sense of, the different stakes involved in answering that question. We want to think about resources. And, we talked a lot about, what concepts are necessary for understanding the argument and that sort of thing. And a really big part of that and perhaps one of the biggest thing we're going to do in this class, and the kinds of questions we're looking at in this class, when it comes to resources and concepts, is we want to be thinking about good sources of information, right? Because it might be relevant in answering that question about, is it wrong to eat non-human animals? There's going to be various forms of testimony that we're going to want to be paying attention to. For example, people where, it's eating a certain type of meal, different kinds of food, these sorts of things, like if that plays a really big role in some aspect of community for them, right? Like we want to be listening to that testimony. We want to be listening to those stories and those people and that perspective. Additionally, we're going to want to be listening to maybe when it comes to looking for like more expert sort of information on this subject, we might want to listen to scientists and researchers that study, the extent to which animals feel pain and or the circumstances that certain animals like live in, animals that are bred for human consumption. We want to be thinking about listening to, the kind of living conditions that they live under, because we might find that, while it's permissible to eat meat, when we can, getting meat that came from animals that were not tortured or something like this, living in really bad living conditions, that might be something that is a morally good thing to do. And we're going to be talking a lot about different examples today concerning ethical short circuiting, like I mentioned earlier. And something that is going to consistently come up is the kind of evidence that we're looking at, the sources that people sort of turn to inform and or support their opinions, or their answers to specific moral questions. So the first step is identifying the question. The next step is, identifying good resources, good places to look for evidence that would support an answer to that question. And that takes us to the third step in a conceptual analysis, where we look at specifically how someone answers that question. So the direct answer that someone gives. So, more like X behavior is morally bad. That is something that we can understand or characterize as the conclusion of an argument. Because when somebody says, X behavior is morally bad, right? What they then do, oftentimes, is give some evidence that supports that answer. So in the third step of a conceptual analysis, we look at specific answers. So that might be answers that we come up with on our own, or it might be an analysis of another answer that somebody else gives. So once we identify what that answer is, again, whether we give it or somebody else has given it, we then want to look to the evidence, right? And that's why it's good to first sort of get in our minds, list off okay, what are the kinds of, who are the people that know about this subject, right? Like, who are the people that maybe do some research on it? Who are the people that would have, really important testimony that we want to listen to with respect to this subject. And then when we already have in mind, the kinds of people we want to listen to and the kind of information that we want to get on it, when we go through and we look at the evidence that either we're giving or the evidence that someone else gives in support of their answer to that question, we are better equipped to sort of say, did they, are they using good sources, right? Did they miss an important group of people, some group of people, some testimony that they gave that they should have considered in their answer? Okay. And then after we do that, so after we've essentially outlined someone's argument, we've outlined sort of their take-home message, which is their answer to that question, and the evidence that they give you or you give in support of that answer. After we have all that clear, we then want to take a beat. And taking a beat involves thinking further about the implications of the argument. So it kind of takes us back to the beginning a little bit where we were thinking about the stakes, right? So thinking about, if it seems all of a sudden you're presented with this argument where it's like, wow, it looks like it's morally bad to eat non-human animals, then we think about implications, right? There, we might have further opportunity to say, this argument misses the fact that it would be really expensive in certain places for people to just cut meat out of their diet, or it'd be really time consuming to completely upend, the kind of food that they make and this sort of thing. So are we placing an unfair burden on specific groups of people in saying that, it's morally bad to eat non-human animals? So we can think about implications in that way. And we're going to be, again, talking a lot about some problematic implications of arguments that are subject to this ethical short circuiting that we're going to be talking about today. Oftentimes when people short circuit in the ethical reasoning process, a big thing that happens is they fail to really see the implications of their argument. They fail to maybe see that some kind of moral behavior they're saying is wrong, for instance, is perhaps targets a specific group, or is easier for one group of people to live up to this moral standard than it is for another group of people to live up to that moral standard. And in thinking about those implications, essentially thinking about, is this a good, in practice, does this moral rule, does this specific rule, this moral value maybe, is that something that is actually going to hurt people? We're going to be thinking about reasons why somebody might then disagree with the argument. So a huge thing that we do in philosophy, and you saw this happen all over me now, is we look at how someone answers a question. In this question, it's going to be some kind of moral question, a lot of moral dilemma type things. And we get clear on what their argument is. We get clear on what the evidence is. And then we try to do our absolute best to come up with the strongest objection to that argument possible. So would somebody maybe like to tell me a reason why it would be good to think about why somebody might object with, say, your argument, some kind of claim you're making, like X behavior is morally good or morally bad? Why might it be good for you to think about how people might object in giving your argument, your answer to that question? Does somebody want to give it a shot? This wasn't anything discussed in the reading. Oh yeah, Sonia.
So that you could have a counter argument for them.
Yeah. So I mean, a big part of it, especially in philosophy, because you have kind of these it's kind of you want to have the strongest argument possible. It can be a little bit combative in that way sometimes. Yeah, you want to be prepared. You want to be ready for somebody to say, oh, well, what about this? And then you're like, well, actually, I thought about this, and this is why it's still okay. Yeah, Laisa.
I'd say so you could protect your reputation as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's important, and you can protect your character.
Yeah, I think that's very much in line with the kind of approach to ethical reasoning that our textbook talks about, where you're keeping your eyes open. You kind of just described it in like a defensive is like has like a negative connotation with it, but in a way that's kind of protecting yourself. But I think that what you were saying is like you're protecting your moral character, right? Like you don't want to end up accidentally saying something that that ends up being really harmful for a group of people. So thinking about those objections in mind, right? Like thinking about, trying to really stretch our brains and our understanding of all of the ways in which, this claim we're making might affect certain groups of people or certain individuals, whatever. Thinking about that, we're really stepping outside of ourselves. And we're thinking about, what kinds of things we're saying people should do in all these different kinds of contexts that they exist in. You're really trying to think about like, okay, like it's leaving yourself open to the possibility that maybe you made some kind of error in your ethical reasoning process, and wanting to make sure that doesn't happen, wanting to make sure to really like listen to other people, think about the context, think about the implications. That's really, I think that those are the two things: strengthening your argument and just leaving yourself open to error as a way of sort of protecting your own moral character. That's great. That's excellent. Yes. So, and again, I'm going to be going through this. I'm going to be bringing this slide back a lot. It's going to be something that is going to come up in various ways on worksheets that you're doing. But this is the step-by-step process. Really like this way that we can kind of slow ourselves down when we're looking at these ethical dilemmas, these moral quandaries, these sorts of things, and move in a methodical way through the reasoning process, ultimately in a way where we try to take care in the way that was described in the textbook, stepping outside of ourselves, thinking about the way our actions or this moral rule we're suggesting would affect other people, and ultimately trying to pick the things, establish moral values that we act on in a way that that promotes what we might call the good, right? That you do morally good things. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about this this conceptual analysis step-by-step process? No? Okay. All right. So what is an ethical shortcut? Like I mentioned earlier, this is essentially something that happens during the ethical reasoning process. So, in the previous slide, one of the reasons why I went through it again is that can give you a sense of, in general, what the ethical reasoning process ideally looks like, right? When we're talking about ethical short circuits, what we're talking about is something that undermines this ethical reasoning process. So is anybody like a science major or anything that could explain what happens when we have, say, like a battery or an outlet that short circuits? Does anybody want to explain what happens there?
I was going to say something. I just out of the top of my head, like when power can go off. Okay, so when power goes off, yeah, that's exactly That's what I was thinking about.
Yeah. So the battery here, I think, like depicts that pretty well. What happens is when something short circuits, so electricity is very sticky in a way. It's going to get pulled towards things that it's attracted to. So when we have something like this cord here, it's sort of controlling where the electricity is moving. And if we introduce something into the environment that is more, it's something that is more attractive to electricity is going to want to go that way. So that's why, I think they do this a lot in movies where they like somebody like puts a power cord in water, right? And it's like, and then like a bunch of people like get electrocuted or something. It's, yeah, I mean, that's a horrible image. Sorry to put that all on you, but I think we're familiar with this thing that happens when you put some kind of live wire in water. All of a sudden you get like the water is like electrified. And if anybody touches it, they get electrified, right? Because electricity really likes water. It's going to go in that direction. And we kind of keep it in these compact cords, really trying to like wrangle it and make it go in the places that we want to go. Okay. So the reason why that works as a metaphor for ethical reasoning is it's very much what we see happening when I just want to make sure, I just wanted to see what people said in the chat. When our ethical reasoning, when our ethical reasoning short circuits, what's happening is our direction, our attention, our ability to reason, like that cognitive energy, you might say, gets pulled off in another direction. So we can think of, the process that I am hoping to teach you in this class, that conceptual analysis, and the ethical reasoning that is involved there, as like the sheath, as like the sheathing, or like the red wire part, and trying to like you want to keep it contained within that system. You want to focus your attention on the right things. And when we ethically short circuit, it's when we have, some kind of like the wire gets cut, or you touch a live wire to some other thing, some sticky thing that really pulls our attention and energy elsewhere. Okay. Would anybody like me to explain that again, maybe in a slightly different way, or do you all feel like you get a general sense of the way that this metaphor is working?
So is it like as you said, yeah, I think you should, it's like I know it's a metaphor, but like power, something happens to your mind, and you're not able to think critically.
Yeah, it's like when you put a power cord in water, and it all of a sudden
and then it sparks.
It wants to spark and like shoot. The electricity wants to like go elsewhere, right? That's what's happening, say, when we do something like offhand self-justification, which roughly understood is like we have like maybe some like biases or prejudices or something like that. Like those kinds of beliefs, for instance, can work in a similar way that water does when you put that live power cord in like a bathtub, where it's like pulling it in all of these other directions. Or yeah, if it touches a live wire, like touches some other material that it's more attracted to, like that kind of attraction, that kind of pull outwards, ends up works in a similar, or it can be understood as an analogy for like prejudice and bias and these sorts of things. Did that you feel clear on that, Victoria?
Yeah, I think it's better.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, so essentially what we want at the end of the day, like to do this ethical reasoning thing well, is sort of like powering a light bulb. We want to direct that energy to the right source. And we don't want other sticky things in our environment that pulls our energy outwards. Because if we don't, if we fall subject to that stuff, we short circuit in that way, then we're not ultimately powering our ethical light bulbs. It's a little bit cheesy, but I think that as we go through more and more examples of the ways that we can ethically short circuit, this will click with people and make a little bit more sense. So the first kind of ethical short circuit that we're going to talk about today is offhand self-justification. So the way that this works is you have somebody, they make a claim, somebody else challenges that claim, and then the first person, the claim maker, just immediately denies that challenge and comes up with some stupid reason for supporting their first claim. So I have like the little GIF here of a cat, stuck in a box, where that kind of is that I think that functions as like a pretty good metaphor for what happens when we do this offhand self-justification. In a way, we make a mess, and then we dig ourselves deeper into that hole. And I think oftentimes, we can really feel ourselves doing this. Right. So one place that I think about this offhanded self-justification thing happening, really anywhere on social media, but specifically when people are fighting, they take a side in a celebrity feud, right? So is anybody familiar with like the feud between the two of the main stars on Sex and the City, Kim Cattrall and Sarah Jessica Parker? Is that ringing any bells for people? Or like Nicki Minaj and Cardi B, like they got into, I think it was like that's the Sex and the City one is like kind of an old one. I think that, the Nicki Minaj and Cardi B. Okay. So Ray, about that. Yeah. Okay. Does it, actually, yes or no in the chat box. You familiar with this Nicki Minaj, Cardi B feud that has been going on for a long time? Okay. All right. Would anybody want to quickly explain what the feud is for the people that don't know?
I think it's because they're both female rappers, and
oh, you don't know what the exact thing is that like
it's sort of an ongoing thing. It just at this point it just piles on every year. But the reason it mostly started was because Cardi B sort of popped off, and then people were saying that she's better than Nicki Minaj, and then people were saying no, nobody can beat the original Nicki Minaj. There's nobody gonna be like her. And then some people are saying, oh, you need to get over Nicki. Like, that was in the past. This is the new era. Like, this is the Cardi B era. And it's like, they're just rappers. They just need to just come down.
Yeah.
Everybody can rap. Like, you got like different kind of male rappers, and you don't hear people saying stuff like that. So they're both females, and they need to hold their reputation and title in the
So not to come down on one side of the debate, but the thing that actually triggered it, and I think that Ray, like what you're pointing at is 100% what is actually going on, but the technically what, like they were looking for an excuse to start fighting. And the thing that tipped it off was Nicki Minaj liked something. I can't remember what social media platform it was, but she liked some post that was criticizing like Cardi B as a mom. Like it was like criticize, like being like, she's a mom, blah, blah, blah. So Nicki Minaj liked the post, and then she unliked it. but Cardi B saw it. So like there it was, I think that like, yeah, they were looking for an excuse. And then like also when you criticize somebody's parenting style, like that doesn't typically like go well with people, you know? And so that's technically where the feud started. But Denise, I don't know how old it is. I mean, yeah, I think that this feud has been going on for so long that this place where it started has clearly gotten lost. Like I actually had to look it up. Like I knew that they had been feuding and I'm familiar with all of the stuff that Ray said, right? But yeah. And in part, you know, the reason why I'm familiar with that is because so much of this debate is between fans, and it ends up centering on this point of like, you know, like who's better and like, you know, who is like more deserving of our attention and these sorts of things. And what you see happen in these debates is a lot of offhand self-justification, right? Like nobody is going in being like, okay, I actually want to know what the answer is to this question of like, you know, is Cardi, did like Cardi like replace Nicki Minaj? Like in terms of like the greatest like rapper who's a woman or something like this. And in those kinds of debates, right, it's pretty easy to imagine like, say somebody who's coming down on the side of Nicki Minaj, like making some of the points that Ray brought up about like, you know, she was like the original, she paved the way, like nobody can outshine that. Like they're not going to be thinking much about this other point. They're like really making this offhand, immediate like self-justification to this counterpoint about, you know, but like, say maybe like Cardi B is just like she's actually like a better rapper, right? Just because somebody was first doesn't necessarily mean that like they deserve to be considered the best for their entire career. Yeah, I mean, or you can do something along the lines of what Kate just said and say, you know, well, like they both suck and this is stupid, right? And no offense, Cade, that also is an offhanded self-justification. This is a stupid conversation. They're both dumb. Like, right? If you don't like their music or you don't like who they are or whatever, you're not going to be willing to really think beyond that, right? And that's the kind, and just to be clear, this question of who's right in the argument may have like different loaded serious moral questions involved with it. I think that like that's some of the stuff that Ray was actually touching on, you know, like why are like two rappers who are women like being pitted against each other? Like why does it seem like there's only space for like one legitimate woman to be a rapper, whereas like we have a bunch of guys that all get to kind of like share this title as like the best, right? So there are important moral questions within the debate. However, you know, who is like right here in terms of Nicki Minaj versus Cardi B, that isn't necessarily the kind of question that you need to pour that kind of energy into, right? Like ideally, whatever amount of energy you're spending on that isn't going to be enough to result in like an ethical short circuit where you're just like firing off all of this energy and devoting all of this time to like, say if like you're a Nicki Minaj fan, like fighting with Cardi B fans like on Twitter or something. So I don't want to be dismissive of certain implications involved in this debate, but you know, if you say like they suck and this is a dumb conversation, I don't want to have it, that's totally fine too. But it is that kind of thing that comes up for people where essentially like we're met with some kind of evidence that is contrary to stuff that we already believe. And almost in a way, when we get defensive, right? It's kind of like when we get sick and we have like these immunity responses, right? So like when you get a cold or you get sick and then you get a fever, like that is a strong response that your body has in the face of some kind of like virus or bacteria that's invading your body. There's this like really strong response. So it's like we can think of that too as a metaphor to what happens when we get really amped up in response to something, like, like looking at like, where is this really strong opinion about like who is the best, who's the best rapper here, Nicki Minaj or Cardi B, like when you get really amped up there, like thinking about where that's coming from, why that defense is so strong. And then understanding like when we get into that place, it can get really hard to keep up in doing, say, like, all right, who do I need? Like, what are some resources I can look to help me do a better job evaluating like what makes somebody a great rapper, right? And understanding that so much of the time, like those strong defense responses that result in us giving some bad reason to, keep pushing our argument. When we can kind of clock ourselves doing that, then there's room for intervention. And this is where the offhanded self-justification offhanded self-justification. That's where we can kind of intervene or try to offset some of the ethical short circuiting, like that firing of energy going in the wrong directions. It's a way we can sort of like hone our attention and get it to that, like get that circuit to the light bulb where we hopefully want to end up. Actually, before moving on, does anybody else have an example of some of this ethical short, like an instance where you've seen somebody do this kind of offhand self-justification? Oh yeah, Victoria.
Yeah, that's what I even wrote. I think this pandemic took this theory to a new level, because I had some members of my church claiming that the vaccine is demonic. And they wouldn't even, they were trying to even convince other people not to take. And I know everyone has their own opinion, but as we've learned so far, if you don't have any evidence to back what you're saying, then you should not even say it in the first place, because some people would just go with it. Or someone said it, I saw it on the news. Oh, I read it somewhere. Where did you read it? And they cannot even tell you exactly where they got their information from.
Yeah.
So if you don't believe in it, don't convince others to also like follow you. So that's what I wrote about the vaccine.
Yeah. And I don't know if anybody like saw my little like comments or my notes on the lecture slide, but yeah, the anti-vaccine stuff is something that I think is something, we have some like very high stakes there, right? Like Victoria was just elaborating on, people that are not only themselves not getting vaccinated, but also trying to persuade other people not to do that, by appealing to ultimately really bad evidence. And when you try to come back, like exactly like Victoria said, you try to come back and say like, well, here's all the evidence to sort of assuage your worries, to like cut back on your anxiety. There's not any openness to hearing that evidence. There's just, oh, okay, like more, I'm just going to only look for more evidence that confirms this thing that I already believe. And we really see ethical short circuiting happening there right off the bat, because there's an unwillingness to look for expert testimony or good sources of information to help determine, whether or not the vaccine is safe. And while I hear what you're saying, Victoria, about everybody being entitled to their own opinion, when we think about the stakes of this question, we're also thinking about how much longer this vaccine is going to be really effective, or how much longer people are going to have to keep dealing with COVID. In particular, there's a lot of people with autoimmune disorders, other kinds of physical disabilities that are in a position now where they're just kind of indefinitely having to stay isolated in their homes as a result of people not getting vaccinated, and as a consequence of people persuading others not to do so. So the stakes are very, very high here. We're talking about, it's truly a matter of life or death for a lot of people. Like, we're seeing the numbers of people in both the UK and the United States living in assisted living, like older people. The numbers of people in those facilities that are dying are higher than they've been throughout the entire pandemic currently. So we're really talking about, the stakes are so high, it's the cost of human life. And if you're ethically short-circuiting in a way that is preventing you from doing a good job looking for the right kinds of evidence to support your argument, then you're doing something, I think, that given the evidence is across the board wrong, regardless of what, your opinion may be. So yeah, I think these are two really, we have like this kind of innocuous, like we have this like Cardi B, Nicki Minaj fight. And then in these ethical contexts, like when we really think about like these high stakes questions, like are people morally obligated to get vaccinated, for instance, that ethical short-circuiting can be very, very harmful. So what can we do to sort of combat it? Because this is also something that I think so many of us are familiar with, where you find yourself just digging into a hole. I think, fights with parents when you were younger is probably like, either you saw your parents digging themselves into a hole, pushing back against something you were arguing with them about, or you dug yourself into a hole, trying to just like, it was just, you didn't, me personally, like I remember fighting about things like I didn't actually even care about, but I just was so intent on fighting and so intent on disagreeing that I was just talking to things that would support what I said. And as a result, when I was a teenager, oftentimes I was like that cat stuck in the box where I'm just like, I'm going and my energy is like not focusing itself in the right direction. So what can we do when in order to avoid this sort of thing, right? So first and foremost is acknowledging that you are a cat stuck in a box. When you feel like tracking, like I was saying, like recognizing that you're just grasping at straws, and acknowledging that feeling when you have it, and recognize that it's ultimately self-defeating. Like you're not making a good point, like give up, stop trying to, like keep shooting all of that energy out, right? Let it go. The next thing that we can do, and this is good to bear in mind when there are certain debates that we feel very, very strongly about, going in, right? And committing to going slowly. So going slowly means stepping back, thinking about what the question is, thinking about what good sources of information would look like, clearly identifying your reasons that support that answer, and then really like taking a beat. This is another step back, like looking outside ourselves, looking at the implications of our argument, really trying to think about like, okay, if I am right in saying like, no, I should get a go out. Like imagine, as a teenager, Like I like telling my mom, like, no, I should be able to like go out with my friends tonight. And my mom saying, but you have school in the morning, right? Or something like this. Like you're spending too much time with your friends. Like you need to focus on your schoolwork. Like you didn't get good grades this semester, that sort of thing. And I'm just like, if I say, back then, like 15-year-old Leah thinking like, okay, all right, what is the actual question here? Like, what are we like, is it objectively a good thing for me? Like my mom is just caring about my well-being. Like for my well-being, is it important that I like go out with my friends tonight, say? And then thinking about, the kinds of evidence, the things that we should think about in backing up, say, why or why not. And then going through and thinking like, okay, all right, so I'm saying like I should be able to go out. Say like I had gotten in a big fight with one of my friends. We just made up. Like this friendship has been really important to me. Like this is a person that like has made like my life at school so much better. These sorts of things. Those are my and like say and I got a B+ instead of an A on like my last English paper. Like that's not that big of a difference, right? Like thinking through and going through in that slow kind of process, even though it might be something that's like really loaded for me as a teenager, and also taking into account what my mom's concerns may have been, going slow, thinking it through can help me not go to the place of just being like, you're always trying to control my life, or like, you always think you know everything, but you don't understand, right? Saying something like that is a lot different than saying like, hey mom, I have been miserable at school for the past couple months because I've been in a huge fight with my best friend and we finally just talked it out and I just want to hang out and we're going to like go do this really fun thing together. I understand you're worried about my grades, but like this friendship, like my people at school are equally important to me. And I need you to see that, right? Those are two very different things. You don't understand versus, like this is something that's important, right? So going slowly can really help us there, and reflecting on your reasons, right? So part of going slowly is reflecting on your reasons. And in that reflection process, thinking about the other side, what the other side is arguing. For the two reasons that Lisa and Sonia mentioned in the beginning of class, right? One, because maybe, probably not, but maybe I could convince my mom by making a strong argument. And two, it's something, keeping other people's perspectives in mind, right? Like stepping outside yourself, like seeing maybe that like your mom isn't necessarily me seeing like my mom isn't trying to like control my life, ruin my life, ignore me, make me miserable, right? Like she's legitimately concerned about me doing well in school or something like this, right? Thinking about that and bearing that in mind and making the kinds of arguments just in general, like having that general practice, that way of engaging with people, helps preserve one's moral character. Going through slowly, methodically, keeping your eyes open to what other people are thinking and feeling in the context of the situation. In general, that just better equips us to make the kinds of decisions and do the kinds of things that are good, morally good things for us to do. And finally, like I had mentioned a little bit before, one of the ways that we can catch ourselves going down that road is noticing when we feel really defensive. And this is something that the textbook talked about. So in those cases where we just have this knee-jerk reaction, like, no, I just want to dig my heels into something and I don't want to hear about the other side. Like I'm going to have this like immediate, like, you're talking to me about Cardi B, but like, no way. Like I love Nicki Minaj. I think we see like a similar kind of like diehard fan base Taylor Swift, right? Like anytime anybody says anything negative about Taylor Swift, there's like Taylor Swift fans kind of freak out about it a little bit, right? So just clocking when that happens and then taking a beat and thinking through some of the other things that we talked about. Okay. So one thing that I want to stress here about, clocking when we're getting defensive is that there are conversations, I think, especially on social media, where we get defensive because somebody is hurting us in what they're saying. So when it comes to these antidotes for offhand self-justification, this process that I just described, remembering it's self-defeating, going slowly, identifying your reasons, thinking about where other people are coming from, that sort of thing. That is not at all what you are obligated to do. It's not something that is going to necessarily like help become a better person, right? Or anything like this. Nor is it going to help you in any way to like have a stronger argument against when people are making the things that people can say. And I'm sure that every single person here can identify an example where something like this has happened, where somebody says something that hurts you, and you have a defensive reaction. This is not an instance where we have that kind of immunity response, right? Where it's like, oh, I don't like hearing about things that contradict the things that I already believe. That's uncomfortable. So like, kind of like having like, it's like a reasoning fever about it. That's not what's happening there. It's that somebody has hurt you and you have a defensive response. Those are two very different things. So Denise, you said Roe v. Wade being an example. Would you like to elaborate on that? Denise. So
Yeah, I was just, I'm sorry. I was just curious if that was a good example, because way back when it was first in effect, there was a big controversy about it. And then now, decades later, like years later, it was brought up again and reversed. So I'm just curious if that would be a good example, because it was a huge controversy where, there were two sides and everyone felt that they were politically correct.
Oh, right. So, sorry, I guess an example of what specifically, like this kind of like hot debate that happens, or an example where,
Yes,
oh, okay.
where
Yeah,
each side thinks that they're right
right. Yeah. So we're gonna,
in their opinions and their way of thinking.
yeah, I think that there's definitely ethical short circuiting that can happen within those debates, where
Okay.
people say things in conversation where they're really ultimately just talking past each other. They're just sort of like digging in to what their own, to like just these like, I think the way that the textbook described it was like these like bumper sticker sayings, right? Like we'll get like these like these
Yeah,
like catchphrases on both sides, like, well, you're a baby killer, you're a murderer,
exactly.
you're like a
Yeah.
blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that sort of that like name calling type thing. And there's most definitely ethical short circuiting that happens there.
Okay.
I do, yeah. So Shanili, or rather, wait, hold on. Shanili, I was thinking about this point too, but I want to, I just want to finish this thing. I want to clarify about, and we're going to be talking about this a little bit more, and this touches on it here, where like we have these things where, it's this very much like both sides need to listen, and there are boundaries that we can draw, right? Although there are two sides. Oh, let's see. I think somebody's mic is still on, and it's, yeah. Can everybody can hear me okay, right? Yeah. Okay. Great, wonderful. So when we have these debates about, you know, like, it's like, well, there's really like two sides to this. I think that there are, we will have the opportunity to really dig into what's going on in this debate concerning abortion. Right now, I just want to flag this as something that can be understood as there is not an obligation for people that are, you know, fighting for access, abortion access. There's not an obligation for them to listen to the other side. And that's in large part because of just the context of the conversations and opposition to it being wrapped up in a lot of really other problematic things that people refer to as moral values, which doesn't necessarily say anything about whether or not access, like abortion, is like a morally like okay thing to do. But in the context here, in the kinds of debates that we're thinking about when we're thinking about these people like really like going after each other, right? In those kinds of back and forths, you know, there isn't necessarily, this is just the kind of debate where we see where there's not people that are trying, given the stakes, there are reasons why people can give, essentially, where they're like not morally obligated in any kind of way to really like engage with like where the other side is coming from. And we can talk about that more with respect to abortion later. I think another excellent example of offhand self-justification is something that Shaneely brought up in the chat box. So she mentioned like when people are advocating for equity and someone is saying like these disparities in equity and inequality like don't exist, and then like blames the group of people that have less equity, not treated equally, blaming them for the situations, for that situation is a really, really good example. So that's a little abstract. Shaneely, did you have like a specific sort of like little bit of dialogue in mind, or a specific topic where this like concerning equity comes up, where you hear this kind of bypassing, this kind of dismissing? And if you don't want, if your mic isn't working or something like this, you can let me know in the chat box, but okay. All right. So, so I think like this is something, maybe not even necessarily blaming a group of people, but this kind of like dismissing behavior, I think, is a really common thing we see when white people say things like, I don't see color. Okay. So how many people, yes or no, in the chat box, how many people have like heard of somebody saying something like this? Yeah, that's what it gets. So yes or no in the chat box. There's somebody saying something like that. Everybody should be answering. Okay. Yeah, everybody. Right. Yep. I've had classes in the past where, I thought that maybe this was like something about, I'm 35, so I thought maybe, because this was something that I often heard growing up, and I grew up in like around like a lot of white people, and this was something that I heard a lot of them say. Yeah, there's just this like very like, it's kind of like Bill Clinton era like approach to addressing social issues connecting to racism. And like Shaneely mentioned earlier in the chat box, this is also something that we can refer to as like colorblind racism, right? Like refusing to even look at the existence of the problem, and that stemming from this knee-jerk reaction to be like, oh, well, I'm not that. Like somebody saying like, I experience these things in my day-to-day life, like sometimes systemic and sometimes coming from individuals where, yeah, like I'm hurt in some kind of way because of these like long-standing social practices. And somebody hearing that, a person who does not have to experience any of those things, a person who is in a place of privilege, and being so focused on this concern, like, well, I'm not the kind of person that does that, they fail to even acknowledge, and this is what Shaniele just added in the chat box, they fail to acknowledge or address the experience and issues that plague people who are like Black and brown, people who and people who are not white. And there's a bunch of different, when we say racism in this class, and like, I'm sure this is something that I don't need to explain to any of you, but there's a bunch of different kinds. And it can look different in different places. And there are, and sometimes when we're talking about bad behavior of like privileged people who don't experience that, like we might focus on some of the bad things that that white people do. But it's just like, it's good to acknowledge that, like, yeah, the way that, racism works is really, can really like vary. And yeah, in particular, when this like people say this thing like, oh, well, I don't see color, right? Like they are oftentimes getting defensive, being worried that somebody's saying that they're being racist against somebody who is not white, who is Black, or Black and brown people, right? So when someone gets defensive in the face of that, right? Like somebody doesn't want to have these very serious things that are an urgent need of our like social attention, right? When somebody gets defensive of somebody being so dismissive in that way, there is no need to stop and think about how maybe your view might be like self-defeating. There's no need to go slowly or reflect on your reasons why thinking that is wrong, right? Like somebody is negating important experiences that are in need of social attention, right? And just because somebody gets defensive, that they're being dismissed in that way is not evidence of an offhanded self-justification. That's a much different animal. Okay. So, and we'll just talk about this very briefly. One big problem, or like, one big problem within this offhand self-justification comes up with this thing that I also teach business ethics, and it's something that I hear a lot of students say in this class, that relates this idea of something called psychological egoism, which is essentially the idea that all human motivations are selfish or self-serving. And that is meant to answer this question of, like, what are we morally obligated to do? People will appeal to this idea of psychological egoism to say, well, everybody's out to screw me, so it's better that I just screw them first. This is about self-preservation. All humans are this way. Therefore, I need to always be out there and defending myself, right? And the reasons given for this is this big claim about human nature. Anytime you hear anybody say it's our human nature to do X, immediately, I can't encourage this more. Immediately, please be skeptical. This is where you want to look at somebody's evidence that they're giving, right? And you want to simultaneously think about, okay, what kinds of studies would need to be done, for instance, to prove this, right? We would need studies for many different populations, millions of people. If you look at the studies oftentimes cited to support these kinds of claims, if there's any studies cited at all, what you find are these very small studies that weren't replicated and that sort of thing. They function as bad evidence in support of this massive claim, because something that's come up, I think something that's come up a number of times in this class, like a lot of people here have already pointed out, there is a lot of diversity in the human population, right? So making a big claim about it's in human nature to be selfish and I have this gives me carte blanche and just acting selfishly is a very bad argument. And it's one that most certainly ethically shortcuts in this way, in this offhanded self-justification way. Like it's very much the self, like justifying, like, because everybody is selfish, I am selfish. This justifies X behavior, right? And one really big problem with it is it's a really easy thing to just see confirming evidence for. So if we say that everybody is selfish and this is the way we act, and interestingly enough, this is something that a lot of research in game theory supports, the people around you are not going to trust you very much, right? And if they don't trust you very much, you're going to see them as not trusting you and doing selfish things, kind of leaving you out of the equation. They're going to assume that you are just going to be looking out for yourself. And so you're just going to continue to see all of this evidence supporting this supposed thing about human nature that justifies acting selfishly. And an important point to remember, actually, so has anybody ever heard this? Yes or no in the chat box. Have you heard somebody say something along the lines of like, especially I think when we hear about like business, like the market and stuff like this, have you ever heard anybody saying this thing? Well, all humans, humans are selfish. So, you really have to like, you have to just advocate for yourself. You just need to like focus on what you need. Mm-hmm. All right, so we got a few no's. So somebody who said yes, can you give an example of a time where you heard somebody say this? Or like a movie or something like that? I am certain somebody here. I can call on somebody too. Let's see.
What was the question again? Sorry.
So the question is, if you've ever heard, give me an example of an instance where you've heard somebody who pulls this like, well, everybody's out to take care of themselves. So you gotta just like look out for yourself. That's how that was like. Those are some good lines that she nearly gave. Ray, yeah.
You really hear that a lot in like career advisors and stuff like that, when they're letting you know that it's like, especially for those individuals that want to work in business organizations, they need to know that it's very competitive. So they need to be like, to get to the top, you gotta be selfish. Like you can't worry about nobody else. Like this is you. Like you're in war right now with these people. Like
yeah, it is like, yeah, it like going to war with people, not here to make friends. You got to be cutthroat, this sort of thing. So it's that.
You hear that a lot. Oh, for college as well. Like, oh, when you go to college, you're not there to make friends, and then when you go to college, that's the first thing you do. So it's
yeah. I mean, yeah, and I think. Yeah, as somebody who works in a pretty competitive field, although the grad center where I am in the last stages of getting my degree, the environment is actually very, very good in terms of the other students. But in a lot of philosophy programs, yeah, it is like, you're supposed to just be like hashing it out. Like somebody does better than you and getting angry about it, like just being like, a lot of like playing favorites and things like this, which is, it's really self-defeating in college, especially because a big part of learning things, maybe, this is less true of some disciplines than it is of others, but definitely in like the humanities and philosophy and social sciences and these sorts of things, like talking with other people to understand things is a huge part of it. So if you're not friends with them, that can make conversation pretty tough, right? Yeah. So Neely says like individualism at its finest. I think that's exactly right. And this isn't to say, so Jose, you bring up a great point. So Jose said some people grow up in hard environments and learn the hard way about human nature. And so they have to be selfish and self-preserving. So I think when you're not talking about human nature there, though, you're talking about really hard circumstances that people are just doing their best to navigate. This isn't because of human nature. It is about bad circumstances. And there are circumstances under which it is actually really good to be selfish, right? Like if you're going through a hard time, right? It may be important for you to prioritize your own needs. Like my best friend lost both of her parents in 1 year. Both of their deaths is pretty sudden. And she is normally like the most, I am there for you, like whatever you need to talk to me at 3 o'clock in the morning. Like I will drive like 3 states over to help you move. Like, I mean, this person is one of the most generous people in the world, I swear. And she was going through a hard time and she had to shut down. She was like, I have to prioritize myself. Like, no, I can't talk. Like, I have to do like X, Y, and Z because I'm really like, I need to work to like protect my own mental health and like my own well-being. And I think that, like that's another example of circumstances under which it's totally fine for people to be selfish, right? I think this is also something that happens like when we realize we're in friendships that actually aren't good for us, right? Like, if you have a friend that is just like always attracted to these like really intense, like kind of like toxic fights and things like this, like always like getting like really mad at you in ways that like you had a really hard time predicting and getting mad at other people that they would have a really hard time predicting and then like getting mad at you if you're not taking their side, right? Like I would think this is probably something that a number of people here are familiar with. And even though you might really love that friend, choosing to be selfish in that moment and being like, you know what, I thought long and hard about it. This friendship is actually, it's actually hurting me quite a bit. Like, I think that, like we shouldn't be friends anymore. If you need to have that conversation or, just like not speaking to that person anymore, like that counts as being selfish under those particular circumstances, right? Like, it's not like you were obligated necessarily to keep going on in a friendship that was ultimately really harmful for you. So there's definitely circumstances under which people have to be selfish, and there is no shame in that. It's more that this idea that it's in our human nature to be selfish, regardless of the circumstances. That is the thing that's wrong. And that's the thing when people rely on that particular claim, that's when they short circuit, ethically speaking. Yeah. Like Denise said, sometimes you need self-love and self-care, and that requires being selfish, and that's fine. It's just not necessarily in our nature to be that way all of the time. And we have plenty of evidence that supports that. Okay. So the next ethical shortcut we're going to talk about is ethical shortcutting due to dogmatism. So roughly understood, dogmatism is the idea, or is an instance where, or when somebody's being dogmatic, is when they hold on to their view no matter what the reasons, like holding on so tight. It doesn't matter. It's just like, la, 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 la. Like, I don't want to hear about it. This is the thing I think. That might involve, or it may instead look like, they might have reasons, right? But again, they're like, la, la, la. They're not willing to entertain any new evidence for thinking the thing that they say. So I think that this little Calvin and Hobbes, maybe some of you who are a little bit older might be familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, little cartoon clip about like, is it a right for a person to remain ignorant? Is it a basic human right for somebody to like stick their head in the sand, like la 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 la? And then Calvin responds, I don't know, but I refuse to find out, right? Like there is some serious ethical short circuiting that happens there. Because Calvin is so committed to this idea that he has a right to remain ignorant about something, that he's like, well, I don't even have to engage with it, right? So we ethically shortcut in a way because we're not even getting started into the ethical reasoning process. It like jams up the gears before anything the motor can turn over. It cuts it off. And it short circuits the ethical reasoning in that way. It stops us from really digging in, trying to think about other perspectives and that sort of thing. So before, I'm going to ask if anybody wants to give an example of somebody being dogmatic in that way. But before we do that, I want to clarify a very important point that I think kind of gets glossed over in the textbook. So there is a difference between dogmatism and an unshakable commitment to moral values, okay? So another key feature of being dogmatic is there's no distinction made in people who are dogmatic in that way, like Calvin, the little boy and this little guy here. People who are like that make no distinction between like fundamental moral values that they have and really just more complicated moral opinions, like how they hang together. So one example would be, like we were talking about a little bit ago, somebody who is anti-abortion access. And they say this is because maybe the Bible says it's wrong and, the sanctity of life comes before all else, right? And they're like, la, 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 I don't want to hear the other side, blah, 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 blah. And then immediately turn around in another context where the death penalty is being debated and say, well, no, they deserve to be punished. They deserve that. People need justice. Like, if you commit certain egregious crimes, like the state is entitled to kill you. Now, this isn't to say that it's impossible for somebody to consistently hold both beliefs. However, they need to be able to explain how those two views are consistent, and people have. So again, like, I'm not saying like just like somebody is ethically short-circuiting all the time just because they are anti-abortion access and pro-death penalty, right? But somebody who's dogmatic about that doesn't even possibly recognize how incompatible those two claims are. Another issue that immediately gets brought up, a lot of people that are anti-abortion access are also against providing any kind of child support care, health insurance, like all of these other, like other social programs that help people with children once those children are brought into the world. So there, if you're against those kinds of programs and you are anti-abortion access, there's something that needs to be explained there. And again, there are people that can explain these things to make them consistent. When we're talking about dogmatism, we're talking about people who are ethically short-circuiting. Like I said, the gears don't start turning. The wheel doesn't turn, the engine doesn't turn over, like nothing's happening. There's there's not even an ability to recognize the inconsistency of those things. What they might instead do is just appeal to some other rule. It's like, well, the Bible says that the death penalty is okay, which I know that I know that the answer is much more complicated than that, but that's the sort of thing that a dogmatist would do if they were sort of presented with this, like, well, how much do we value the sanctity of life? Because it seems like in one context you do, and then in one context you don't, right? So dogmatists are not thinking about how the implementation of different fundamental moral values might get complicated, and be open to understanding and engaging with the complicated nature of the implementation of those values. Importantly, another thing that that we should keep in mind when we're talking about, especially what we're going to talk about shortly with the antidotes, coming up with antidotes for dogmatism, is related to what we were talking about with the antidotes for offhand self-justification, and there being certain contexts where we have a different, one flag might be, I got defensive in response to this thing that somebody said, but it's a different process in addressing issues that come about from people making claims that hurt you. And similarly, in avoiding being dogmatic, it's important to recognize that there are instances where we have unshakable commitments to certain moral values. And if we have somebody that is presenting something, like presenting some kind of, making some kind of claim, saying some kind of thing that is obviously like some kind of abhorrent, clearly morally wrong thing to say, there is no obligation for us to go about the process that I'm talking about in the next slide, which is to say, when people present morally abhorrent opinions, just because we have an unshakable commitment to our moral values, those kinds of statements contradict, does not mean we are obligated to listen to the other side. It does not necessarily mean that we are obligated to make space for those opinions. So one huge problem, I don't know, actually out of curiosity, in the chat box, yes or no, do you even sometimes look at Twitter? Yes or no in the chat box? That's like a quarter of the class. Everybody keep going. Yes or no, do you even sometimes look at Twitter? Yeah, and if you don't have it, then okay. I think that's almost everybody. Okay. So the only reason why I ask is because Elon Musk purchased the platform, and I just wanted to see if there was anybody, and it seems like at least like a third of the class like sometimes looks at Twitter. So you probably have realized that it's a little bit different since he's taken over. And yeah, depending on like what your like people are that you follow and things like this. One huge problem that's happened is he almost entirely gutted their department that handles reporting other people on Twitter. And Elon Musk's justification for this is he says like, we're going to just be broadly accepting of different values rather than trying to impose our own values on the world. And ultimately what this looks like in practice is making space for a lot of really egregious, misogynistic, very racist, anti-Semitic, I mean, really like any kind of like extreme version of a prejudice that you can imagine. People are like able to like go and like troll accounts and say really horrible things, attack other people. So like that thing that we were talking about earlier about how claims can be really hurtful, that mindset that, you know, everybody has different values and we need to make space for all of those values, right? What that entails is making space, a lot of space for people to hurt other people. So just because you draw a line somewhere doesn't necessarily make you dogmatic. Although people like Elon Musk try to argue otherwise. Now, you can be open to potentially looking at the ways in which maybe you drawing that line hurts other people, right? But at the end of the day, if people are trying to say things that hurt other groups of people, especially vulnerable groups of people, right, then there's limited responsibility in having to engage with that stuff. And when we consider, the customer base that made Twitter what it is today, and B, just like, the impact that Twitter has just on various kinds of public perceptions and things like this. Obviously, this can't, this kind of thinking, this like putting any rules in place is not necessarily imposing values, right? It's doing other things, and it's much more complicated. All right. So I wanted to just really clarify that before we talk about antidotes to dogmatism. Okay. So antidotes for dogmatism. So one, we're really like head in the sand, like, nope, these are just like, these are the rules that like my mom told me to live by. I'm not going to like think about them at all or what justifies them, or, like the rules of a specific religion, these sorts of things. Like, no, I just follow it blindly without question. And anytime anybody tells me that it's wrong, I just go la, 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 or I just point to another rule and I say, well, that rule says that this is fine, right? So avoiding getting into that kind of space is going to involve doing a better job listening to people, right? So that's a big part of the taking care bit that we talked about, where, if somebody's saying like, there's certain implications to the thing, this moral obligation you're placing on people, and I think that, that might be something that isn't a great value to uphold, or that results in a kind of treatment of a specific group that's not okay, right? One way to sort of combat the dogmatism is just by simply listening and taking care in that way, and understanding that there's like a bunch of different ways that things might affect people, and kind of trying to hear out the people who are negatively affected, and also like really thinking about what your evidence is, thinking about what their evidence is. In other words, why does the other side believe what they believe? What reasons do they have? Why do I believe what I believe? What reasons do I have? Is it because it's just a rule? Or do I see good reason for following the rule, right? There's a difference between trying to just follow, like identify all the rules in the Bible, for instance, and just follow all the rules in the Bible and have a reason for following those rules, right? There's a big difference between those two things. One of them involves dogmatism, and the other most certainly doesn't necessarily involve any kind of ethical short-circuiting. For a lot of people, that is like a kind of like a foundational guide for their ethical reasoning processes. But that leaves open, the non-dogmatic approach leaves open space to listen to others, to listen to other people who maybe don't agree with us. And when those conflicts happen, trying to identify maybe some things that you might have in common, some like general concerns that you might have in common. And in doing that, really embodying a sense of like humility and being, and when we say embody, or when I say embodying humility, all I mean is like just leaving it open to be maybe just a little bit wrong, right? Recognizing that we're humans, we're fallible. There are certain things that we can definitely believe without question, but there might be other bits of these complicated moral conversations that could ultimately, one could ultimately be wrong about. And like keeping our eyes open, looking for that good information, or looking for good expert testimony, looking trying to really see where other people are coming from, especially if they're saying they're experiencing, it's like some kind of view you have like hurts them in some kind of way. Embodying humility there, like being like, okay, maybe I'm wrong, just creates a little bit of space for you to do a better job listening. So that's generally the ways that that we could combat like a tendency towards dogmatism. So this is again kind of coming back to this point I made here about having this difference between an unshakable commitment to certain moral values and being dogmatic requires answering this question of, okay, well, that sounds all fine and good in theory, but when, right? When should we be sure about some unshakable commitment that we have? And that part is just thinking carefully and slowly and weighing evidence carefully and slowly, just moving as slowly as we can, and in our own time. So potentially identifying, things that are really important to us, sitting on it, thinking about it when we can, because there are circumstances in everyday life where we won't have time to move that slowly. And in those cases, it can be hard to figure out when we can be sure of like an act or a way that like we're responding in the right way to things. Since we're running a little bit short on time, I'm not going to get into those questions. What I want to do instead is, well, first, can somebody give me an example of some kind of dogmatism that they've witnessed? Like either you did it, somebody you saw did it, you saw it on TV, whatever. I'm sure that somebody here.
Say that again.
So I'd like somebody to give me an example of an instance where they saw somebody, or maybe you yourself were being dogmatic. You short-circuited, ethically speaking, because you were being dogmatic.
I think one example is, I'm not going to try, and this, I'm not going to try a homosexual relationship because I know that I am straight. Like there is no thinking whatsoever. Like your response is going to go straight to, this is who I am. There's no negotiating that.
Yeah. Is that a rule though? Would you say that that's like a rule?
No, not necessarily a rule, but it would be a person saying, I'm not doing this because I know that I'm that. There's no reason for me to try to date, I'd say, women if I know I like men.
Yeah, you're not necessarily, but that's not, I think this is a good place. So there's not just instances where it involves a, unshakable ethical commitment or whatever.
Okay.
Like there are other things, there's like facts about the experience, like that's also like, yeah, I think that's, we want to be thinking, it's not really a moral question of, like dating, whether you should like be open to like dating somebody who you're not interested in dating, regardless of like what that person's gender is, right? Like you also aren't obligated to date any guy that asks you out either. Right?
Right.
Yeah. Ray, did you want to add, or did you want to give a different example, or either?
Yeah. I'd say an example of that would be I'm having an argument or like a discussion with somebody, and they're expressing to me how they're feeling, and I'm like completely dismissing it because like I'm thinking of my impulsive thoughts, like I'm angry, so I'm gonna react instead of like thinking and like, okay, let me listen to what the person is saying. Like I'm just gonna react and say, no, I'm right, you're wrong. It's not that.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds more like the offhand self-justification thing. I think that's definitely something that happens when we get in fights with people we're close to. Right? Where like, yeah. Like dogmatism involves more like thinking about some kind of like set of rules that like dictate somebody's opinions about things.
I think I got it. I could say two people having two regular individuals having a conversation, and randomly a conversation of a topic of religion comes out, and it's like one person says this thing about the religion and the other person says, no, that's not what I heard. Like, this is what I heard about you guys. And it's like, instead of listening from this perspective of the person who's there, this is their religion, they know what they're talking
Yeah,
about, but
yeah.
but the other person is being defensive as to, no, this is what I learned from past experience. That's not it, you know?
Yeah. So I think this is this is something, and again, I think this was something that was a little, I don't know if it's as common now. I feel like this was like a classic kind of like pop intellectual scientist type person. When I was younger, like there's this guy, Richard Dawkins. He's an evolutionary biologist. And then more recently, Neil deGrasse Tyson, who he's another like kind of like science pop figure. And both of them have this incredibly dismissive attitude towards people who are anything other than like staunch atheists. And their whole thing is like, well, you know, like and I'm sure that that you all have like heard, Jose, that is exactly right. He's awful. It's like they love being like, oh, look at the dogma of religion, and it's just this lie, and people are just like making up these like fairy tales, saying these like really deeply horrible, offensive, very, very dismissive things. And the thing that is so frustrating about it is how hypocritical they're being, because in order to have those kinds of arguments, they have to be equally as dogmatic concerning their specific understanding of science. They refuse to look at anything, any evidence of something that, like, you know, a gap that science doesn't fill, or space to both believe, have like a commitment and a belief, like having like total faith in science and having total faith in one's religion, right? Like they refuse to look at any of those possibilities, anybody's relation, or like their relationship with faith, that doesn't involve like this very hard line, very narrow understanding of the types of things that science can tell us, right? And yeah, so that's like another instance where we see like a lot of dogmatism, and it's especially frustrating because they're being such hypocrites about it, right? So yeah, those are good. If we just like think about any sort of like text or sets of rules involved with something concerning like human behavior, human life, and then just sort of blindly following those rules without question, really doing the like la 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 la, like I'm not going to listen to anything else, and only holding tight on that stuff, and feeling, I think importantly, like these are really simple, like having the rules and then it feeling like, well, this is a simple answer to this problem, right? Like the answers to the questions that we're going to be looking at in this class, like the important ethical questions, concerns, and dilemmas that are happening now, right? Contemporary ones. Those are ones that are going to be really complicated answers. And anything that is trying to present itself as this like, oop, I got a silver bullet to this ethical dilemma, right? Like, well, we're all selfish, therefore everybody should be able to act selfishly. Or, well, science already tells us it's everything, so we don't really have to worry about, you know, God existing or anything like this, right? Like those kinds of views oversimplify. And when something oversimplifies in that way, when people are saying like, here's my silver bullet to this really complicated process, that's when your alarm bell should go off. When somebody, just like when somebody makes this big old claim about like the nature of human nature, right? Not paying attention to the circumstances, alarm bells go off. Very likely that person is short circuiting, ethically speaking. Okay. Great. Kate, I'm not exactly sure what you understand, but I'm glad that you feel that way. So what I want to do now is I want to take just a few minutes. I'm going to have us come back. So stand up, breathe, run to the restroom. We're going to come back at 11, and then you're going to go into your breakout groups. Okay.